Hi. Let's take a few minutes to discuss the concepts associated with the idea called cell theory. Now, what you're going to find is that this is going to relate back to some ideas that we've already discussed in an earlier chapter, in Chapter 1. It's going to relate to those concepts or characteristics we discussed that describe living things. Also, as we had talked about before, you're going to find that this idea can be traced back to the 19th and 18th century. Okay? And so we're looking at some ideas in terms of how they were first developed and then how we still make use of those basic ideas today. First of all, we're talking about a concept that reached its final stage of development in the 19th century, approximately the mid-1800s. But what we see is something whose ideas began in the 17th century. All right. Now, our concepts that I had mentioned before about what makes something alive have changed over time. But one thing we focus on today, a central concept of the idea of what makes something alive, is the idea of things being composed of cells. All right, so we're going to see that this idea of life is going to be directly associated with this concept of cell theory. Now, the authors of cell theory were a number of people, but we could talk about four key contributors to this idea. First, we had Hooke, Robert Hooke, and he was the first person to actually make use of the word cell. He was a microscopist, biologist. He was slicing thin specimens of cork, the bark from a tree, and as he looked at them under his microscope, he saw that there were these little chambers or boxes. Well, the term for someone's room or the chamber in which they lived was a cell, so he referred to it as a cell. He says, here are the compartments, the building blocks that I'm finding in some of these thin slices of material that I'm making. Schleiden and Schwann came along after this period of time, and basically what they were doing were surveys. They were looking at a number of different kinds of organisms. In the case of Schleiden, plants, Schwann, animals, and basically what they found was that, gee, every time I grind up or slice and then observe specimens of plant material, animal material, guess what I find? Cells. So you could think of the step that they contributed to cell theory as being the discovery that it looks like everything that we call an animal is made out of cells and everything that's called a plant is made out of cells. Well, Virchow comes along and realizes that these two fellows have been talking about a common idea, and he gives his own contribution to this. But basically, he comes up with the statement of, it looks as if what we have here is that all living things are composed of cells. So that's the essence of cell theory, is this idea that those things that we categorize, label as life forms, have this organizational scheme that we call a cell. That's the basic unit of living things. Well, think about the idea in terms of what the different contributions were of different people, and we can summarize it somewhat differently. We can think of it as having maybe three components, cell theory. All right, so we're saying that cells are the basic unit, the smallest basic unit of life. All living things are composed of these units we call cells. Remember, that's our definition. Not everybody agrees on this, but this is clearly the most widely accepted viewpoint. All living things are composed of cells. All right, so the smallest basic unit of life is a cell, and even multicellular things, any life form, we'd say, are composed of these small basic units. The final thing, and this is also something that Virchow contributed to the discussion, was he said that anytime we see a cell, it must have come from some pre-existing cell. Interestingly enough, at the same time that cell theory was being developed in the mid-19th century, what we find is that microbiologists at the same time are developing what's referred to as the germ theory of disease. And there's a lot of interesting parallels. But realize that as people became aware of these single-celled living things, as they looked at multi-celled organisms and they found some consistency in the basic structural features of those things, they chose to make that a key attribute of what we call a life form. All right, so as I say, while it's not accepted by all biologists, it clearly is the most widely accepted, you might argue that it's one of the key components that most people would include as a feature of the definition of life. All right, so living things are composed of cells. All right, cells are the basic unit of life. These cells have a key feature, which is a membrane. We'll be talking about features of the structure of membranes and the functions of membranes. But realize we're saying there has to be some kind of container for that living material that we call the cell. It has to have a limit, right? A boundary between itself and its surrounding environment. And we call that boundary, the primary boundary, the membrane. And we'll talk about, as I mentioned, some of the clear features of the function and structure of that cell membrane. What's its primary function? Well, it creates a difference, right? It creates a situation in which I have a certain kind of internal intracellular environment. By that I mean certain chemical solutions and certain concentrations of different ions and molecules. And the membrane then separates that, the intracellular environment, from the extracellular environment, the environment outside the cell, where I would expect there to be different kinds of aqueous solutions and molecules and mixtures of different kinds of chemicals. So one of the key features we're going to see in general with membranes, and of course with the cell membrane itself, by the way, it's also called the cytoplasmic membrane, and it's also sometimes referred to as the plasma membrane. That is going to be a device used to separate different environmental conditions. Also, you could think of it as what? The limit of the cell, right? What else? Within the cell, what we find is that cells have to have some type of informational molecule, a hereditary molecule. And when we look at cells, we find that all these different things we call cells, all these things we call life, use DNA as their hereditary material. The DNA in the cells, we say, is organized into packages of information called genes, units of information. The hereditary material is passed on from one cell generation to the next cell generation. Remember what Virchow suggested, that all existing cells came from pre-existing cells. That process of one cell giving rise to new cells has to involve the copying and the transmission of that information molecule. And the key feature of what that information molecule, that hereditary molecule, does for the cell is it gives it sets of instructions, abilities that allow the cell to interact and live in its particular environment. It has the information for the structural and functional features of the cell. Okay? So, I have the cell. It has within it informational molecules, coded information. And later, we'll be discussing how is that information coded? How is it retrieved? How can I know what it says? Living things also, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about how these cells are compartmentalized regions. They're packages of aqueous solutions. Membranes create barriers between solutions, and one of the key reasons for having this kind of separation of solutions is to carry out the processes of metabolism, the chemical reactions that go on within a cell. Large numbers of different kinds of chemical reactions. Some of them, in general, you could think of them as resulting in the building of things, making things, and we call that anabolism, or the anabolic portion of the chemical reactions in a cell. We could loosely classify the other half of the reactions as being reactions that are involved in different aspects of taking things apart, breaking things down. And so we find that we have the catabolic portion of metabolism, or catabolism. So we could say that these chemical reactions within the cell that are compartmentalized, that are held within different regions of the cell, typically by membrane barriers, are going to be involved in carrying out two broad types of chemical processes: building, breaking down processes, converting energy processes. Collectively, they're all called the metabolism of the cell. And we think of metabolism as being a key feature of living things, right? Within that key unit of life called the cell. All right, so energy conversions, going to be a key topic we discuss. building reactions or processes, anabolism, breaking down processes, decomposition processes, catabolism. All will be ideas that we'll be focusing on discussing in relation to individual cells. And we'll focus on where they occur in those cells, the different regions of the cell that have these different responsibilities or activities. All right, so think about what the basic idea was behind cell theory. If we recap, we're saying that, you know what, we're saying that this thing called a cell is the basic unit of all life forms. Everything that we're going to refer to as being a life form, people in general accept, are composed of these structures called cells. We say that even multicellular organisms are composed of these same building blocks, individual units called cells. Whenever I see cells, I'm going to assume that they're the result of some older cell having split or divided or multiplied in some way to give rise to this cell. Okay, so those will be the features that we'll be thinking about when we work our way through the study of the cellular functions of life. Most of the rest of our semester focuses on organisms at the cellular level. You can see that's going to be our focus. 4 people responsible for those components of that idea, 4 of the microbiologists, biologists that contributed to this concept. And we said that this cellular nature is one of the key characteristics of living things, and that cells require information molecules for control, regulation, something that can be passed on to the future generations. And they're going to require specialized chemical reactions of building and breaking down and energy conversion that occur in specialized regions of the cell. So you can see we're going to be focusing on a variety of these components of the function, the nature, the structure of cellular processes. All right, look forward to talking to you about all those interesting and varied things.